The snow fell like broken promises across the Dakota wilderness. Chaitan's horse stopped without command, sensing what the warrior's heart already knew. Death walked these frozen woods tonight. But beneath the skeletal branches, a small form trembled against the white silence, and the Lakota warrior felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with the bitter cold. The child's tears had frozen on his cheeks like tiny crystals of abandonment. In that moment, Chaitan understood that some wounds could only be healed by opening your arms to the very thing that should destroy you. The wind carried more than snow through the pines that December evening. It carried the scent of death and the faint, desperate crying of something too small to survive what was coming. Chaitan pulled his buffalo robe tighter around his shoulders, his breath forming clouds that disappeared into the gathering darkness like prayers no one would answer. His horse, a paint mare named Wakinyela, had been restless all day, her ears twitching at sounds only she could hear, her hooves dancing nervously on the frozen ground as if she knew they were riding toward something that would change everything. The warrior had learned long ago to trust his horse's instincts more than his own, and tonight those instincts were screaming warnings he couldn't yet understand. The crying grew louder as they moved deeper into the forest, a sound so raw and broken it seemed to tear holes in the winter silence. Chaitan's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, then stopped. This wasn't the sound of an enemy or a trap, but something far more dangerous to a man's soul. It was the sound of complete helplessness, of a small life calling out to an indifferent universe with nothing left but hope, and the terrible faith that someone somewhere might still care enough to answer. His jaw tightened as memories he'd buried years ago began to surface, like bodies rising from a frozen lake, memories of another child's cries that had gone unanswered, of promises broken and lives lost to the endless war between his people and the white settlers who kept pushing west. When he finally saw the boy, Chaitan's first instinct was to turn away. The child sat huddled against the base of a massive pine, his small body nearly invisible beneath a thin coat that offered no protection against the killing cold. His hair was the color of winter wheat, his skin pale as fresh snow, and his eyes, those blue eyes that looked up at Chaitan with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, belonged to the same people who had burned Lakota villages and slaughtered women and children. Without mercy. This was the enemy's child, abandoned to die in the wilderness, and by all rights Chaitan should have ridden past without a second glance. The boy's lips were blue with cold, his small hands clutched uselessly at his inadequate clothing, and the tears on his cheeks had begun to freeze into tiny diamonds of despair. But something in those blue eyes stopped the warrior cold, something that spoke to a part of his heart he thought had died with his own son 3 winters ago. The child wasn't looking at him with the hatred or fear he'd expected, but with the simple, trusting hope of someone who still believed the world might contain mercy. There was no calculation in that gaze, no awareness of the bitter history between their peoples, just the pure, desperate need of a small life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Chaitan felt his throat tighten as he remembered another pair of eyes, dark instead of blue, that had looked at him with the same trust before the fever took his boy away and left him hollow as a winter tree. The memory hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over in his saddle, as grief he'd thought buried forever came roaring back to life. The boy tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper above the wind, but the words came out in English, the language of soldiers and settlers, of broken treaties and burned villages. Chaitan didn't need to understand the words to know what the child was asking for: warmth, safety, someone to care whether he lived or died in this frozen wasteland. The warrior's hands trembled as he dismounted, his feet crunching through the snow toward a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to let the winter claim this child as it had claimed so many of his own people, but his heart, that treacherous, wounded thing, wouldn't let him turn his back on such naked vulnerability. As Chaitan knelt beside the boy, he saw his own reflection in those frightened blue eyes and realized that mercy was sometimes the cruelest gift of all. The child reached up with one small, frozen hand, and the warrior felt something inside him break open like ice, giving way to spring water, painful and necessary and completely beyond his control. He wrapped the boy in his buffalo robe, feeling the small body's desperate need for warmth, and knew that he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The wind howled through the pines like the voices of his ancestors, warning him of the price he would pay for this moment of compassion. But Chaitan no longer cared about the cost. The ride back to the village passed in a silence broken only by the boy's chattering teeth and the steady rhythm of Wakinyela's hooves on the frozen ground. Chaitan held the child against his chest, feeling the small body gradually warm beneath the buffalo robe, and tried not to think about what he would tell his people when they saw what he'd brought home. The boy had stopped crying, but his blue eyes remained wide and watchful, studying the warrior's face with an intensity that made Chaitan uncomfortable. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that suggested this child had already seen more of the world's cruelty than any 5-year-old should have to bear. The warrior found himself wondering what had brought the boy to that frozen forest, what tragedy had left him alone and abandoned in the wilderness like an offering to the winter gods. The village fires came into view just as the snow began to fall harder, their orange glow painting the night with promises of warmth and safety that Chaitan wasn't sure he could keep. He felt the boy tense in his arms as they approached the circle of teepees, and he understood the child's fear. To him, these people were probably monsters from the stories his parents had told him, savage warriors who scalped children and drank blood under the moon. The irony wasn't lost on Chaitan that he was bringing home a child who had been taught to fear everything about the life he was about to offer him. The warrior's jaw tightened as he thought about the stories his own people told about white children, about their cold hearts and their inability to understand the sacred connection between all living things. The first person to see them was Ayana, an elder woman whose husband had died in the last cavalry raid, and the look of shock and anger that crossed her weathered face made Chaitan's stomach clench with dread. She spoke in rapid Lakota, her voice sharp with disbelief and growing fury, and other villagers began to emerge from their teepees to see what the commotion was about. The boy pressed closer to Chaitan's chest, his small hands clutching at the warrior's shirt, as if he could somehow disappear into the man who had saved him. The crowd grew larger and more agitated, voices rising in heated debate about what should be done with the white child, and Chaitan felt the weight of their judgment like stones pressing down on his shoulders. When Takoda, the village chief, finally appeared, his face was a mask of controlled fury that made even the bravest warriors step back. He was a man who had lost 2 sons to white soldiers, whose wife had died of the diseases the settlers brought with them, and his hatred for the Wasiku, the greedy ones, was legendary even among the Lakota. He spoke to Chaitan in a voice like winter thunder, demanding to know why he had brought this enemy child into their sacred space, why he had risked the safety of their people for the sake of someone whose very presence was an insult to their dead. The boy couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the hostility radiating from the crowd like heat from a fire, and his small body began to shake with more than just cold. Chaitan stood slowly, still holding the child, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had already lost everything that mattered to him. He told them about finding the boy in the snow, about the choice between mercy and vengeance, about the way the child's eyes had reminded him of his own son's face in those final moments before the fever claimed him. His words fell into the hostile silence like stones into deep water, creating ripples of doubt and confusion among the gathered villagers. Some of the women began to murmur among themselves, their maternal instincts warring with their hatred for the white race, while the warriors remained stone-faced and unmoved by his plea for compassion. The debate that followed seemed to last forever, voices rising and falling like the wind through the pines, but Chaitan barely heard the words. He was watching the boy's face, seeing the confusion and fear there, and he realized that this child would never truly belong anywhere, not with his own people who had abandoned him to die, and not with the Lakota, who would always see him as a symbol of their suffering. The warrior felt a crushing weight settle on his chest as he understood the magnitude of what he had done, the impossible burden he had placed on this small life by choosing mercy over wisdom. When Dakota finally raised his hand for silence, the entire village held its breath, waiting for a decision that would echo through generations yet unborn. The seasons turned like the slow grinding of ancient stones, and Will Thompson grew beneath the endless Dakota sky like a sapling, finding strength between two different soils. His hair had darkened under the prairie sun, and his small hands had learned to weave grass into rope, to track rabbit prints in mud, to speak the sacred words that called the morning spirits home. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, when Chaitan thought the boy wasn't listening, Will would whisper English prayers his dying mother had taught him, clutching a small wooden cross hidden beneath his buckskin shirt. The warrior pretended not to hear these whispered betrayals, but each word cut deeper than winter wind, reminding him that love alone could not erase the color of skin or the memory of blood. The other children accepted Will with the casual cruelty and unexpected kindness that marked all young hearts, but their parents watched with eyes that never quite softened. Ayana, the medicine woman, would nod approvingly when Will helped her gather healing herbs, yet her smile never reached the deep places where old wounds festered. The men would grunt acknowledgement when the boy successfully shot his first arrow true, but their praise carried the weight of reluctant surprise, as if they expected him to fail simply because his ancestors had failed them. Will felt these invisible barriers like a constant ache in his chest, the way a broken bone remembers every change in weather, and he learned to move through his days with the careful grace of someone who knew that acceptance was a gift that could be withdrawn without warning. Chaitan watched his adopted son navigate these treacherous waters with a mixture of pride and heartbreak that threatened to tear his warrior's heart in two. The boy was learning to be Lakota with a dedication that shamed some of the tribal children, yet Chaitan could see the loneliness that lived behind Will's determined smile. During the long winter evenings, when the wind howled like the voices of the dead, and the fire cast dancing shadows on the lodge walls, Will would sit close to Chaitan's side and ask questions that had no easy answers. Why did his skin burn red in the sun while the other children turned brown? Why did some of the elders look away when he tried to greet them? Why did his dreams sometimes speak to him in a language he barely remembered but somehow understood? Chaitan would stroke the boy's hair and speak of the Great Spirit's mysterious ways, but inside his own heart, doubt grew like a cancer that no medicine could cure. The turning point came on a morning when the snow lay thick as buffalo hide across the sleeping earth, and Will discovered the frozen body of a white trapper caught in one of the hunting snares near the village boundary. The man's face was blue with cold and twisted with the final agony of a death that had come slowly, and his pale eyes stared sightlessly at the grey sky that had offered no mercy. Will stood over the corpse for a long time, studying the familiar features that might have belonged to his own father. And when Chaitan found him there, the boy was weeping with a grief that seemed too large for his small body. The warrior knelt beside his son and pulled him close, feeling the child's tears soak through his shirt like warm rain on drought-stricken ground. And in that moment, both of them understood that the boy's white blood was not something that could be forgotten or forgiven, but a burden they would carry together until the end of their days. That night, as the village slept beneath a blanket of stars that seemed close enough to touch, Chaitan sat alone by the dying fire and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would take Will away from the tribe, away from the suspicious glances and the whispered conversations that stopped whenever the boy appeared. They would live alone in the wilderness, father and son bound by choice rather than blood, and perhaps in the vast emptiness of the prairie, they could find a peace that neither white nor red world seemed willing to offer. The decision felt like cutting away a piece of his own soul, but as he watched Will sleep, with one small hand clutched around the hidden cross, Chaitan knew that love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice, the willingness to become an exile in service of another's happiness. The fire crackled and died to glowing embers, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the indifferent moon. And Chaitan closed his eyes and prepared to become a man without a people for the sake of a child who belonged to neither world. They left the village on a morning when the mist hung low over the frozen river like the breath of sleeping spirits, and the only witness to their departure was an old woman who stood silent in her doorway, watching them disappear into the white wilderness with eyes that held more sorrow than judgment. Chaitan had packed their few possessions with the methodical care of a man who knew he might never return, and Will walked beside him with the trusting faith of a child who believed that home was wherever his father chose to make it. The snow crunched beneath their feet like broken bones, and their breath formed small clouds that vanished almost before they could be seen, as if the very air was eager to erase all evidence of their passage. Behind them, the village grew smaller and smaller until it became just another shadow on the endless white landscape, and ahead lay only the vast uncertainty of a world that had no place prepared for a Lakota warrior and his white son. They built their new home in a hidden valley where a warm spring kept the water flowing even in the deepest winter, and ancient pines stood like silent guardians against the wind that never stopped singing its lonely songs. Chaitan taught Will to build shelter with his own hands, to read the language written in animal tracks and weather signs, to find food where other men would see only emptiness and death. The boy learned with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that survival was not guaranteed, and his small hands grew calloused and strong as he helped his father create a life carved from the raw wilderness. In the evenings, they would sit by their fire and Chaitan would tell stories of the old days, when the buffalo ran like thunder across the plains and the Lakota rode free beneath skies that seemed to stretch into forever, and Will would listen with the hungry attention of a child trying to memorize a world he had never known but somehow inherited. The isolation was both blessing and curse, offering them freedom from the judgment of others, while trapping them in a loneliness that sometimes felt like drowning in an ocean of silence. Will grew taller and stronger with each passing season, his body adapting to the harsh demands of their wilderness life, but Chaitan could see the questions multiplying behind the boy's eyes like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Who was he really, this child caught between two worlds and belonging fully to neither? What future awaited a boy who spoke Lakota like a native son but carried the face of his people's enemies? These questions hung between them like smoke from their evening fire, never quite spoken but always present, and Chaitan felt the weight of them pressing down on his shoulders like stones that grew heavier with each passing day. The answer came in the form of a cavalry patrol that stumbled upon their hidden valley on a day when the spring air carried the promise of summer, and Will was practicing with his bow near the water's edge. The soldiers appeared like ghosts, materializing from the morning mist, their blue uniforms stark against the green wilderness, and their leader, a young lieutenant with eyes the color of winter sky, stared at Will with the shocked recognition of a man seeing his own reflection in an impossible mirror. The boy stood frozen, with an arrow nocked but not drawn, his face a mask of confusion and fear, while Chaitan moved slowly from the shadows, with his hands visible and empty, knowing that one wrong gesture could turn this moment into a massacre that would destroy everything he had tried to build. The lieutenant dismounted and approached with the careful steps of a man walking through a field of hidden traps, his gaze moving between the Lakota warrior and the white child who stood beside him like a living contradiction to everything the soldier thought he understood about the world. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of military training, but also a tremor of uncertainty that betrayed his youth and inexperience. He demanded to know who Will was, where he had come from, why he was living like a savage in the wilderness instead of receiving a proper Christian education among his own kind. The questions fell like blows against Chaitan's heart, each one a reminder that the peace they had found in their hidden valley was as fragile as morning frost, and that the outside world would never stop reaching for his son with grasping fingers that promised salvation but delivered only separation. Will looked from the soldier to his father and back again, his young mind struggling to process the implications of this unexpected encounter, and in his eyes, Chaitan saw the beginning of a choice that would define the rest of the boy's life. A choice between the safety of belonging and the courage of remaining true to the love that had saved him from the snow. The standoff stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, with the morning sun climbing higher and casting long shadows that seemed to divide the world into territories of light and darkness. Lieutenant Morrison, for that was the young officer's name, stood with his hand resting on his saber hilt, not in threat, but in the unconscious gesture of a man seeking comfort from familiar things in an unfamiliar situation. His soldiers remained mounted but alert, their rifles ready but not yet aimed, waiting for orders that their commander seemed reluctant to give. Will felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure against his skin, and for the first time in his young life, he truly understood what it meant to be caught between worlds that viewed each other as enemies. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the gentle murmur of the spring and the soft snorting of the cavalry horses. And in that silence, the future hung balanced on the edge of a knife. When Will finally spoke, his voice carried the clear certainty of a child who had found his truth in the depths of his own heart. He told the lieutenant that Chaitan was his father in every way that mattered, that the Lakota had taught him not savagery, but wisdom, not hatred, but love, and that he would rather die in this hidden valley than live as a stranger among people who shared only his skin color. The words came out in English, but they carried the cadence and dignity of Lakota speech, and Lieutenant Morrison found himself staring at a boy who seemed to embody everything the army had told him was impossible. A white child who had not been corrupted by Indian influence, but somehow purified by it. The officer's certainty began to crack like ice in spring sunshine, and he found himself questioning orders that had seemed clear and righteous when delivered in the safety of the fort, but now felt like instruments of cruelty designed to tear apart something beautiful and rare. Chaitan watched his son speak with a pride so fierce it threatened to stop his heart, but he also saw the way the soldiers' faces hardened with each word, the way their hands tightened on their weapons, as if Will's loyalty to his adopted father was itself an act of rebellion that demanded punishment. The warrior knew that words alone would not be enough to protect what they had built together, and he began to calculate distances and angles, preparing for a fight that would likely end in death, but might at least give Will a chance to escape into the wilderness they both knew better than any white man ever could. The spring bubbled peacefully beside them, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on its banks, and somewhere high above, an eagle circled on motionless wings, watching the scene below with the patient attention of a creature that had witnessed countless such moments of decision throughout the long history of the world. But Lieutenant Morrison surprised them all by slowly removing his hand from his weapon and taking a step backward, his young face struggling with emotions that his military training had never prepared him to handle. He spoke of duty and regulations, of the proper place for white children in a civilized world, but his words lacked conviction, and his eyes kept returning to Will's face with something that might have been envy for the boy's absolute certainty about where he belonged. The other soldiers shifted restlessly in their saddles, sensing their commander's hesitation and growing uncomfortable with a situation that defied the simple categories of friend and enemy that made their dangerous work bearable. Minutes passed like hours, and the sun climbed higher, and still the lieutenant stood frozen between the demands of his orders and the evidence of his own eyes that sometimes love could transcend the boundaries that men drew on maps and in their hearts. Finally, with a gesture that would haunt his dreams for years to come, Lieutenant Morrison turned away from Will and Chayton and walked back to his horse, with the heavy steps of a man carrying a burden he had not expected to bear. He told his men that they had found nothing in this valley but empty wilderness, that their search for hostile Indians would continue elsewhere, and that the report he would file would mention only the peaceful beauty of a hidden spring, where no human foot had ever trod. The soldiers looked confused but obeyed, and within minutes the patrol had vanished back into the forest as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the fading sound of hoofbeats and the lingering scent of leather and gunpowder. Will and Chayton stood together in the sudden silence, father and son bound by a love that had just survived its greatest test. And in the distance, the eagle cried once before disappearing into the endless blue sky that belonged to no nation and recognized no borders save those written in the human heart. As the sun reached its zenith and the spring sang its eternal song, Chayton placed his hand on Will's shoulder and felt the boy's strength flowing back into him like water returning to a drought-stricken land. And he knew that whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together as they always had, not as Lakota and white, not as savage and civilized, but as father and son united by a bond that no army could break and no law could dissolve.